Got a headache? The medieval doctor, who probably learned his craft through an apprenticeship rather than any formal education, might suggest drilling a hole in your skull. This practice, called trepanation, involved literally boring into your head to release evil vapors trapped inside. Surprisingly, evidence shows some people actually survived this procedure. Archaeological finds reveal healed trepanation holes, meaning the patient lived long enough for the bone to regrow. Would you trust someone with a hand drill to put a hole in your head to cure a migraine? Bleeding was the go-to treatment for almost everything. Medieval medical theory was based on the idea of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile that needed to stay in perfect balance. Too much of any humor caused illness, so the logical solution was to remove the excess. Since blood was the easiest humor to access, bloodletting became the treatment of choice for everything from fever to broken bones. A typical bleeding session removed about a pint of blood, roughly 10% of your total blood volume. This would leave you weak, dizzy, and actually less able to fight off whatever was making you sick in the first place. If one bleeding didn't cure you, the doctor might recommend several more. Leeches took bloodletting to another level. These slimy creatures were collected by the thousands and applied to a patient's skin to suck blood. A standard treatment might use 5 to 10 leeches at once, each drinking about a tablespoon of blood before dropping off. Leeches were especially popular for localizing the bleeding. If you had a swollen knee, they'd slap leeches right on it. Some medieval hospitals kept thousands of leeches on hand, with dedicated staff just to manage the leech supply. Potions and concoctions made from bizarre ingredients were standard medicine cabinet items. A popular remedy for joint pain combines crushed earthworms, pig marrow, and herbs into a paste applied directly to the skin. Got the plague? Try drinking a mixture of ground emeralds, unicorn horn that is actually narwhal tusk, and treacle. Can't afford emeralds? Powdered toads might work instead. These remedies cost a fortune and did absolutely nothing helpful. Surgery existed, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, it was essentially torture with a medical purpose. The most advanced painkiller available was strong alcohol or opium if you were lucky. Most people just got held down. Surgeons prided themselves on speed rather than precision. Wound care often involved cauterization, burning the injury with red-hot metal to stop bleeding. This not only caused excruciating pain, but also increased infection risk by creating burned tissue where bacteria could thrive. Alternative treatments included packing wounds with spider webs, somewhat effective as a blood clotting agent, but definitely not sterile, or applying mixtures containing honey, which actually does have some antibacterial properties. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. About 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years, with infection following delivery being a leading cause. Midwives offered the best care available, using herbal preparations and practical experience passed down through generations. Male doctors rarely attended births unless something went catastrophically wrong, at which point their interventions often made things worse. Mental illness received some of the strangest treatments. Depression might be treated by restraining the patient and spinning them in a special chair until they vomited. Seizures were sometimes treated by drinking fresh blood from a recently executed criminal. People exhibiting erratic behavior might have holes drilled in their heads again with the drilling, or be confined in early asylums where curious townspeople could pay to watch them like a zoo exhibition. Many effective herbal remedies did exist in medieval times, but they were mixed in with so many useless or harmful treatments that finding actual helpful medicine was like finding a needle in a haystack. Willow bark, which contains a form of aspirin, was sometimes used for pain, and certain molds, early forms of antibiotics, were occasionally applied to wounds. But for every effective treatment, there were dozens of dangerous ones. Despite all this, dedicated medical practitioners were doing their best with the knowledge they had. They genuinely believed these treatments worked, carefully documenting case studies and refining techniques. Unfortunately, without understanding germs, circulation, or basic anatomy, even the most caring doctor was more likely to harm than heal. Just when you think your medical options couldn't get worse, a new threat appears on the horizon. Once epidemic disease hit a medieval community, all bets were off. Your odds of survival plummeted from maybe to good luck with that. It starts innocently enough. Your neighbor has a cough. No big deal, right? People cough all the time. A few days later, more people in your village are sick. Still nothing to panic about. Winter colds spread easily when everyone's huddled together in smoky hovels. Then someone dies, then another, and another. Within a week, bodies are piling up faster than they can be buried. The Black Death was the superstar of medieval plagues, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe and Asia between 1347 and 1351. That's 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population, gone in just 4 years. The scale is almost impossible to grasp. Imagine looking around your town and seeing every second person disappear. The disease came in 3 lovely varieties. Bubonic plague caused painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, armpit, and groin. These buboes grew to the size of apples, turned black, and eventually burst, releasing foul-smelling pus. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood before suffocating on their own fluids. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream directly, causing victims to develop black patches on their skin as they bled internally. Some people went to bed healthy and were found dead by morning. Without understanding germs, medieval people came up with wild theories about the plague's cause. Popular explanations included bad air called miasma, divine punishment, astrological misalignment, and deliberate poisoning by marginalized groups. Jews were particularly targeted, with many communities being massacred after being falsely accused of spreading the disease. The treatments were as bizarre as they were useless. Doctors advised sitting between 2 large fires to purify the air. Others recommended drinking a glass of your own urine every morning or applying a paste of dried toad to the buboes. Some physicians advised against bathing, not that many people were bathing anyway, because water opened the pores and let in disease. Wealthy people carried posies of herbs or pomanders filled with scented materials to ward off the bad air. The most recognizable plague doctor outfit, with the bird-like mask and long robes, actually came later during the 17th century outbreaks. Medieval plague doctors wore whatever protective gear they could find, often including gloves, but the iconic plague doctor look hadn't been invented yet. Many doctors refused to treat plague victims, fleeing infected towns along with anyone else who could afford to leave. Those who stayed often died alongside their patients. For those left behind, religious processions and mass prayer services became common, ironically creating perfect conditions for the disease to spread further as infected and healthy people gathered together. Some communities turned to extreme forms of penance, including groups of flagellants who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Death came quickly once symptoms appeared, usually within 2 to 7 days. But what made plague particularly terrifying was the randomness. Some families lost everyone, while their neighbors remained untouched. Some towns disappeared completely, while others, just a few miles away, suffered only minor losses. The plague wasn't a one-time event either. After the initial catastrophe of the Black Death, smaller outbreaks continued to pop up every 10 to 20 years for centuries. London experienced devastating plague years in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and 1665, with thousands dying each time. Your chances of living through an entire lifetime without experiencing at least one major epidemic were slim. Plague wasn't the only epidemic disease to fear. Smallpox regularly killed 30% of those infected and left survivors scarred for life. Typhus, spread by the same lice you were already covered with, caused delirious fever before death. Tuberculosis was so common that the pale, thin appearance of its victims was considered fashionable. The worst part? No one understood why these outbreaks happened or how to stop them. Each epidemic seemed like the apocalypse, unpredictable, unstoppable, and completely mysterious. All you could do was pray, hide, or run. If you were among the lucky survivors of an epidemic, your medieval world would be dramatically altered. With so many dead, labor became more valuable, increasing wages for peasants. Land prices dropped, social mobility increased as survivors inherited property from multiple dead relatives. The plague years actually improved economic conditions for many survivors if you can appreciate better wages while climbing over piles of corpses. Even if you dodged the plague, medieval life had countless other ways to catch you off guard. Medieval law enforcement was nothing like the investigative procedures seen in modern crime dramas. There were no trained officers, no forensic experts, and certainly no crime scene investigations. Instead, most villages had a constable, often just an unlucky local who was forced to take the job for a year. He had no formal training, no real authority, and his only weapon was usually a wooden staff. The role was less about solving crimes and more about maintaining some semblance of order. If a crime occurred, it was up to the entire community to react. The system relied heavily on a practice known as the hue and cry. If someone witnessed a crime, they were expected to start shouting and chasing after the perpetrator. This wasn't just encouraged, it was legally required. If you ignored the hue and cry, you could be punished yourself. The goal was to get as many people involved as possible, forming an impromptu mob to track down the suspect. There was no real investigation beyond catching someone in the act or relying on eyewitness accounts, which, given the time period, were often unreliable. When it came to punishment, medieval justice was anything but fair. The penalties were harsh, and there was little distinction between minor offenses and serious crimes. Stealing food because you were starving? That could cost you a hand. Poaching a deer from the king's forest? You might be blinded or executed. In 13th century England, records show that about 75% of all death sentences were for property crimes rather than violent offenses. This meant that stealing a sheep could be a hanging offense, while a noble who committed murder might walk free if they paid the right fine. Trials, if they happened at all, were often absurd. If there was no immediate evidence, an accused person could be subjected to a trial by ordeal. These trials were less about determining guilt and more about testing divine intervention. One common ordeal involved carrying a red-hot iron bar for several steps. If your burns healed quickly, it was seen as proof of innocence. If they festered, you were guilty. Another ordeal required the accused to be bound and thrown into water. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. If they floated, they were guilty and faced execution. In theory, these ordeals placed justice in the hands of God, but in practice, they were often a death sentence. The wealthy, however, had plenty of ways to avoid the brutal consequences of medieval justice. Nobles could often bribe officials, negotiate a fine, or call in favors to escape punishment. Clergy members or anyone who could convincingly recite a Bible verse could claim benefit of clergy, which reduced their sentences. This loophole was exploited so frequently that even criminals who weren't actually clergy would memorize verses just in case they needed an emergency legal defense. While the rich could literally buy their way out of trouble, the poor had no such luck. If a starving peasant stole bread to feed their family, they could face mutilation or death. For most people, the best survival strategy was to avoid drawing attention. Living under the radar, staying out of trouble, and not crossing the wrong people were essential to avoiding the brutal consequences of medieval justice. But even if you managed to stay off the constable's radar, another authority was always ready to demand your obedience and your money. The church and the feudal lords imposed their own rules and taxes, and failing to comply could be just as dangerous as breaking the law. In the end, medieval justice wasn't about fairness, it was about maintaining control. Harsh punishments kept the lower classes in line, while the wealthy enjoyed protections that made them nearly untouchable. Justice was a privilege, not a right, and for most people, survival meant learning how to navigate a system that was stacked against them from the start. With these kinds of odds stacked against you, the smartest medieval survival strategy was staying invisible to authorities. But that became difficult when another power demanded your attention and your money. The church watched over every aspect of your life, from birth to death. Go to church or else. Missing Sunday Mass wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you hauled before a church court and fined. People took careful note of who showed up and who didn't. Skip too often, and whispers of heresy might start following you around. Those whispers could eventually lead to serious consequences, including exile or worse. Then there were the tithes. A mandatory 10% of everything you produced went straight to the church. Had a good harvest? The church got their cut before you could even celebrate. Raised 6 healthy piglets? 1 belonged to God, or rather his earthly representatives. An average peasant paid between 25 to 30% of their income in various religious fees and tithes throughout the year. Special occasions cost extra. Getting married, pay the priest, baby baptism, that'll cost you. Last rites for grandma, open your purse. These sacraments weren't optional in medieval society. They were essential for salvation. The church effectively controlled the only path to heaven and charged tolls at every step. While you struggled to feed your family, many high-ranking clergy lived in luxury. The contrast was stark enough that many medieval folk songs and stories mock greedy priests and corrupt bishops. But you better not sing those songs too loudly. The church's grip on society was nearly inescapable. And speaking of inescapable, let's talk about another medieval challenge. You might think finding love would offer a nice break from medieval hardship. Think again. Marriage had about as much to do with romance as farming had to do with vacation. First step, find someone. Or more accurately, have someone found for you. Your father might trade you to the miller's son to secure better grain grinding rates, or your family might push you toward the blacksmith's daughter because her dowry included a cow. Love? That was a bonus feature, not a requirement. Marriage wasn't just an emotional investment, it was primarily financial. Even the poorest families scraped together something for their daughters to bring to marriage. No dowry often meant no marriage prospects, leaving many poor women with few options beyond service or the convent. The actual marriage process was surprisingly casual for most commoners. While the church officially required a ceremony, many peasants simply declared themselves married before witnesses and moved in together. This common law approach was widely accepted until religious authorities cracked down on informal unions. Once married, the division of labor was strict but practical. Both spouses worked from dawn to dusk. Medieval marriage was an economic partnership for survival first and foremost. Honeymoon phase, more like, honey, it's soon time to have children phase. Most couples began trying for children immediately after marriage. With infant mortality rates around 30% in the first year of life, families needed multiple births to ensure survival. Records suggest the average medieval woman gave birth 5 to 7 times. The strangest part? Despite these practical considerations, evidence shows many couples did develop genuine affection. They just didn't have the luxury of waiting for love before securing their economic future. Having navigated the marriage market, you'd soon discover another struggle. You might be tempted to take a trip to clear your head. Bad move. Medieval travel made modern airport security lines look like a luxury spa experience. First problem, the roads were absolutely terrible. What passed for highways were often just muddy tracks that became impassable after rain. No asphalt, no gravel, just dirt that turned to mud or dust depending on the weather. Many routes followed ancient Roman roads that hadn't been maintained for 800 years. Even major trading routes could become so rutted that wagons broke their axles regularly. Distance was measured not in miles, but in days. A good day's journey on foot might cover 15 to 20 miles if the weather was perfect. On horseback, you might manage 25 to 30 miles. A loaded cart, maybe 10 miles on a good day. The 200-mile journey from London to York would take around 10 days on foot, assuming you didn't get lost, robbed, or stuck in mud along the way. Speaking of getting robbed, highway bandits were a constant threat. Travel through forests or remote areas, and you risk encountering armed men who would happily relieve you of your possessions or your life if you resisted. Some regions were so notorious for banditry that travelers would join together in large groups for protection, waiting at towns until enough people gathered to move safely. Royal officials were supposed to maintain law and order on the roads, but their jurisdiction was limited and their presence rare. Many nobles charged protection fees for crossing their lands, which was basically legitimized robbery. Refuse to pay, and you might face charges of trespassing. If you managed to cover a day's journey without being robbed or breaking a leg in a pothole, you'd need somewhere to sleep. Inns existed mainly in towns and along major routes, but their quality varied wildly. Expect to share a bed with multiple strangers, often alongside fleas and bedbugs. Privacy didn't exist. Most inns had common sleeping rooms with multiple beds. Your private room might just be a curtained-off section of the main hall. Food at inns was typically limited to whatever was in season locally. The infamous meat pies often contained mystery meat that was best not questioned too closely. Innkeepers were known for watering down ale and overcharging travelers who had few alternatives. Most medieval people never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace during their entire lives. After experiencing the joys of medieval travel yourself, you'd understand why they preferred to stay put. Having survived the perils of the road, you might wonder if all these challenges, from food to disease to travel, were worth it. Could anyone really survive in medieval times? Well, let's consider the bigger picture. After trudging through the many torturous aspects of medieval life, from the constant hunger to the endless work, the filth, disease, and danger, it's time for a reality check. Most of us modern folks wouldn't last a week in medieval times, and that's not an exaggeration. Consider this. Studies of medieval skeletons show that about 50% of children didn't make it past age 5. Those who survived childhood often had signs of malnutrition, with bone analysis revealing many suffered from rickets, scurvy, and other vitamin deficiencies. Even the nobles weren't immune from health problems. Their skeletons often show signs of gout from their rich diets. Then there's the matter of pain tolerance. We modern humans reach for painkillers at the first sign of discomfort. Medieval people, they lived with chronic pain as their constant companion. Toothaches went untreated until extraction became necessary, without anesthesia, mind you. Arthritis was just part of aging. Injuries healed improperly, leaving lasting pain. Our psychological resilience would fare no better. Imagine the constant anxiety of potential starvation, the omnipresent fear of sudden violence, the grief of watching multiple children die, the strain of never experiencing true privacy. We've grown accustomed to conveniences that medieval people couldn't even comprehend. Running water, climate control, instant communication, reliable food supply. I personally think I'd crack within days from the constant itching of lice and fleas combined with the total absence of toilet paper. Leaves and moss were common wiping materials, a far cry from our quilted scented rolls. The wealthy used cloth, which servants would then wash. Even if we armed you with modern knowledge, your chances wouldn't improve much. Try explaining germ theory to people who believe illness comes from bad air or divine punishment. Attempt to introduce crop rotation to farmers who'd risk starvation by deviating from traditional methods. Your modern ideas would likely get you labeled a witch or heretic faster than you could say basic hygiene. The truth? Medieval people weren't just like us, but with worse technology. They were tougher, more resilient, and adapted to hardships we can barely imagine. They accepted daily realities that would send most of us running for therapy or medication. So next time you complain about slow internet or a delayed food delivery, remember, at least you're not drinking ale for breakfast because the water might kill you, all while wondering if tonight's the night wolves break into your hut.